They say the goal of being a Christian is to become more Christ like and to show an example of Jesus Christ in your behaviors and your words. But when I look at your Afro American Negro pastor, I do not see an example of Christ that is presented in the Bible. Instead, whenever I look at this Afro American Negro pastor and the fruit that he produces, there's nothing Christ like about this Negro pastor in many cases. When we look at your Negro pastor, who is supposed to be an example of Christ and follow the model that Christ presents in the New Testament, your Negro pastor falls far short. Now, I know that all humans have sinned and come short of God's glory and grace. However, when one says they want to be a pastor or a preacher, they're supposed to be held to a higher standard because, if the pastor cannot follow the word of God, then how can he teach others? And if the pastor is not an example of Christ, then how can people see Christ within him? And when I look at your Afro American Negro pastor, he pretty much shows the world how he feels about Christ in his actions more so than his words. Now, a lot of Negroes will sit there and listen to the sermons that this pastor preaches, but what makes a pastor, an example of Christ are his actions. And his actions speak louder than his words. When we look at many of these Negro churches in these inner city neighborhoods and how they are, you know, all lavish and all decked out. And we look at the Afro American Negro community, which is one of the poorest communities in the world. That says a powerful statement, about how this pastor regards the people who follow Christ. I mean, if the pastor was really concerned with the people, he would be trying to show again how he could improve the quality of life in his community through his actions. I mean, we look at your Afro American Negro community, the pastor who's supposed to be Christ like, why is he not, speaking out against many of the issues in the black community? I mean, Jesus often spoke against these hypocrites and liars in your black in your in the communities in the Bible, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, um, who are participating in many of the behaviors your Negro pastor is participating in right now, whereas they preach one word, but then they practice another. And, that's what Jesus did. He called these people out. But your pastor won't call out many of the issues in your Afro American community. He won't talk about, the Bible, which says fornication is a sin. He won't say a single word about, this 70% of women having children out of wedlock. He won't say a single word about all these numerous abortions that African American Negro women participate in. He won't say a word about any of the gang violence, the dope dealing, the crime. He won't preach sermons on this about how people should be doing unto others as they would have them do unto you. And that, if you wouldn't want somebody to hurt you, then you shouldn't hurt them. He won't preach those sermons, nor will he preach to this African American woman that you are supposed to be the helpmeet and support, and you're supposed to try to support the men in your community. No, he won't preach those things because he's not Christ-like. No, your Negro pastor again does not follow Christ. Instead, your Negro pastor follows a religion that I can't believe it's not Christianity, and the head of that church is the white liberal, aka white Jesus. And this white liberal is who the Negro pastor follows and, promotes a doctrine of. And the Negro pastor, you can see by the fruit that this Negro pastor bears that he follows the narrative of the white liberal because the Negro pastor only lives to make money off of the Afro American Negro, especially the Afro American Negro woman. Because if this Negro pastor was following the word of God, again, why is the Negro pastor participating in acts like fornication with his own church members? Why is the Negro pastor taking tithes out of the storehouse to enrich himself and not enrich the Negro community? I mean, those 10% of tithes that this Negro pastor gets, those tithes are supposed to help poor families, pay rent if they're struggling, pay their electric bill if they're struggling, provide food and resources for the people in the community who are in need, But the Negro pastor instead takes that money, goes out, buys himself a Lexus, goes out and buys himself a nice home in the suburbs, goes out and buys himself designer suits, and does not spend any money at all on the needs of the people in the community. The church was supposed to help the poor, but the church only enriches itself from the poor in the Afro American Negro community. That's not Christ like at all. I mean, Jesus didn't come to exploit people. He didn't come to enrich people. He came to save people's souls and offer them the gift of salvation. And while he was doing this, he showed, through his miracles that he is the way and the truth and the light, and he wanted to show people, a way that somebody did care about them, because a lot of people felt they had no hope. But when I look at your Afro American Negro pastor, he doesn't give anybody hope. He doesn't, show that Christ-like example. He isn't that role model for the community. He is not that, moral pillar. I mean, he's not trying to be Christ-like at all. Instead, he's trying to be like this white liberal who is all AKA white Jesus and trying to get people to be more like him, instead of trying to be more like the living God whose word he manipulates and uses to exploit people for as a tool. And that's why I look at your Negro pastor and I'm, so hard on him, because he says he's a man of God, but the God he truly serves is not the living God and who is written in the word of this God of the word of God. Instead, he is taking the word of God and manipulating it to fit the narrative of a white liberal, white Jesus, and a dysfunctional religion, which preaches one narrative to people, but then the people practice another. And that's why your Afro American Negro community is lost, because its spiritual leaders aren't Christ like. Instead, they are just like the false God they have been worshiping, for the last 40 or 50 years. Your Negro pastor, you know, is the reason why, the house of God, sadly, has become a den of thieves. And because he preaches a false doctrine to people, people are winding up becoming more and more spiritually lost with each passing generation. And when I look at your Negro pastor, this is why I believe, spiritually he's going to be beaten with more stripes, because your Negro pastor, has the power to galvanize people in the black community to try to do better. But instead, he sits there and enables this debauchery, justifies this debauchery, and supports this debauchery and this chaos in the black community with his own silence. And because he's silent and refuses to speak on the issues in the black community that are causing all of this chaos and dysfunction, and he refuses to preach, because he wants to get that 10% off the top, out of this Afro American woman's pocket, and he wants to get the pennies of this Afro American woman. He refuses to speak on what needs to be spoken on in the African American community, to get it back to a spiritual and moral center where you will have a functional Afro American community. And what I find is really sad is that you have Negroes in the community who won't speak against this Negro pastor. They'll sit there and say, this Negro pastor is a man of God. This pastor, you can't say anything about him. When I look at Jesus' example, the Son of God, questioned the church. The Son of God, who is one of the most powerful beings in the universe, came down to earth. And not only was he questioned, and he was a man of God, if you look at it, he was questioned by people, he was challenged by people, but you can't question this Negro pastor who's just the son of an ordinary man. I look at that and I go, that's one of the most backwards things I have ever seen. The Son of God can be questioned by men, but men can't question the Negro pastor who is just a common man. And that shows, how backwards, Afro American Negro Christianity truly is. We put a man on a higher pedestal than the living God and the Son of the living God. And we put the example of men higher than the example of God and the Son of the living God, who came down to earth to die for all the sins of mankind. But the Negro pastor is considered, higher than them. And that's what's so completely backwards about Afro-American Negro religion. it does not follow what God has put in place, so that people could have a relationship with him and form personal connections with him. Instead, you have these pastors presenting a false doctrine, all in the hopes of getting money. But then again, Jesus talked about this, and he said that, these are the same people who would, devour widows' houses and, do all sorts of stuff. And nothing has really changed. That's why I can say, your Negro pastor is not Christ-like. He reminds me so much of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes, and all the people, that Jesus talked about in his encounters that were written in all four Gospels. And I look at that, and it shows me that, again, nothing has changed, and that, even though the times are different, the church, sadly, is still the same. And instead of people trying to be Christ-like, they're trying to, ascribe to the standards of man instead of the standards of God. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.